Right. Well, the Black Lives Matter movement has grown from an American coalition highlighting the issues of black people in the country to a global one that is embraced by people across cultural and racial lines within the South African context. Does this movement include those who currently consider themselves as black in the country, such as Indian, colored, and Asian people? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by author and columnist Jamil Khan. Jamil, good evening, and thank you very much for your time tonight. Are we approaching this debate and this issue the correct way by having compartments of Black Lives Matter, Colored Lives Matter? I'm sure the Indian community will rise and also say, well, Indian lives matter, and so it will continue.
I think that we are still very much caught up in a sort of the divisions of the past and thinking about ourselves in terms of the way a system has classified us. I don't think it's useful for us to do that. When we start hashtags like Colored Lives Matter, it makes and of course it's the context in which this hashtag has been started. It has been started in response to an event that has happened, and it's made under the assumption that when somebody says Black Lives Matter, that is an automatic disavowal of the fact that colored lives matter. And that's just, it's not the case, right? So I think we are all positioned differently in a country where a past of racial hierarchies have set us up in particular ways, and those differences still exist, and so our lived experiences differ. But I must agree with one of the sentiments shared by, I think, somebody on Twitter that said our government neglects all marginalized groups, and in fact the idea that there's now benefit in being black is contained to a very small elite group, and so no, I think the approach is a little bit problematic, and that we should understand that now more than ever, if we are going to address this issue, that we should look at it in terms of the fact that we are all marginalized by a government that has promised change and progress.
So I understand the fact you're raising. We're still so much suffering from the aftershock of apartheid, and that psyche is still pretty much in our minds, and this trauma is resurfacing. So explain to me a little bit further the role of colonialism and capitalism in exploiting these prejudices.
Well, yeah, so we have, we have a very long colonial history in this country, and what that comes down to is, a history of enslavement, a history of sort of indigenous people being indentured and kept in slave-like conditions. And we also have a history of Indian people who have been, who lived for many years as indentured laborers. And so through the system, of course, there was the allocation of resources. And what had happened a long time ago was the idea that those who were previously enslaved, who were then freed, if you will, and with, the migration of African people from other places in the continent, and also people being enslaved and brought in for the purposes of labor. When that system of slavery no longer existed, people were forced to compete in a capitalist system that basically allocated a very small proportion of the resources available in this country to that group, and they were forced to fight amongst each other. And that, of course, so often people try to say, no, it's not a race issue, it's a class issue, or it's an economic issue. But the point about that is that the way in which the economics of this country is set up is that it is inextricably racialized. So when you have a group of people who, for all intents and purposes, are oppressed by the same system, but the ways in which resources are allocated to those people differ by ethnicity or race, the experience of their access to economic resources become racialized. And that ultimately is a fight that has endured for centuries, and it still exists today. So the enmity and the mistrust and the sort of, how can I put it, the arguments that ensue between people based on racial and ethnic differences are actually about a fight for resources. Because when you're faced with the possibility of not eating at night, and you understand that there's somebody who is racialized differently to you who might just get a little bit more, it breeds a bitterness, and justifiably so. So this is where we are at the moment, with a colonial struggle that has endured for centuries.
Yeah, one might even say, I mean, take it further now, access to political, and you've already mentioned material power in South Africa. It's a race against that. Now, in that backdrop, talk to me then about how do you address this issue when you have a community, an Indian community and a black community, all those communities coming to one, being immobilized, unable to move forward in their communities, unable to move forward economically, and then they see a small margin of a particular grouping of the elite moving forward. How do you address them all and give them a sense of, well, we are all in this together?
It's a very difficult thing, especially at a level whereby the decision-making is about, me not being able to get a job to feed my family based on my perception that I'm racialized in a particular way. But I really, really think, and it can sound sort of high level and impractical, but I really think even if it is just in terms of the way in which we interact with each other, because our government has abandoned the project of political education. In fact, it is in their interests not to educate people. And so I really think that we need to invest more in even just amongst each other. Like excavating history and histories that have been concealed. And the things that I'm talking about, this history of the ways in which certain systems were created and then later ended, and new systems of oppression within sort of created, or old systems were rebranded. Because that's also what we're sitting with today, right?
Yeah.
We're sitting with a country in which a system was not dismantled. It was rebranded as something new.
Yeah.
But the foundations of that system still remain. And so I really think we need to invest in political education around history, because I feel like we sort of missed, we missed this time around, and we've abandoned the need to interrogate history because we thought we beat it. But we didn't. So what we really need to do is have honest conversations about where we come from.
Yeah.
We need to in legitimate and also concealed histories that have been deliberately kept from us. And honestly, through that, I believe when we look at our histories and the trajectories that we have followed as people, we will understand that, yes, it is exactly the same system that has positioned us in the way that we are now positioned, and not recognizing and naming that system for what it is what's going to keep us.
The other most debated issue, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is the term colored itself, Jamil, and others are saying, well, it is actually a racial grouping, while others are saying, well, it's a term that apartheid used to describe non-white people. And therefore, there was this huge blowout on Twitter around whether colored people have a culture and what that culture is, and so on and so forth. Just unpack that for me a little bit.
So it's interesting, a very long time ago, I think it was probably in the mid to late 1800s, and in a time where Dutch as a language still operated in society. The term colored, which at the time was translated from the Dutch kleurlingen, actually referred to all people who literally had color to their skin, as opposed to white people who didn't. And so there was actually a time in this country where all black people were referred to as colored, because it was a literal terminology that described the color of someone's skin. Over time, of course, these things evolve and develop, and political agendas creep in. And then we move on to apartheid South Africa, whereby the terminology was then used to, to classify people who either had historical links to enslavement, and obviously people who came from Southeast Asia and other African countries, and also had some links to colonial bloodline, and then those who were considered African, as in people whose heritage predominantly stemmed from the African continent. But the irony about it is that the process was extremely flawed, and in fact. The criteria for classifying somebody was very, very arbitrary, and it came out of a logic that said, if we can't exactly pin you down as purely black or purely white, then we're going to give you some intermediary status. And this is actually the I mean, it's painful. It's painful to think about the ways in which we today perpetuate such white supremacist logic when we talk about pure races. Because the implication there is that those who are not of pure races are from impure races. Yeah. And to classify human beings as impure is an extremely, extremely dangerous thing to do. So we have today actually a grouping called colored people who, for all intents and purposes, are a group who share cultural similarities or in some ways uniformities, yes. But ethnically are very much African people. But because of the desire to create, but also this buffer, this buffer population between white and black, because the apartheid government was very, very meticulous about understanding the psychology of people, and so they needed something to protect.
Listen, Jamil,